Then let's start down under because Australia's central bank kept its benchmark policy rate steady at 0.1%. This comes as the country's economy is striving to recover from the setback caused by the Delta outbreak. But rising prices are indeed a problem the country has to face. For more on that, let's get to our correspondent Greg Navarro, who's standing by for us live in Sydney. Greg, it is a bit of a delicate balancing act for central bankers in advanced economies. On the one hand, you have inflation risks rising, but on the other hand, policymakers also want to keep benchmark rates low to save the recovery. So tell us more about the latest rate policy from the Reserve Bank of Australia and what impact might it have on the broader economy?
Well, you're absolutely right, Jonathan. It's not just a problem that regulators here in Australia are facing. It's one that many countries are dealing with, how to get the right balance as you emerge from the pandemic. While you've got people doing the fiscal responsibility, you've got governments as well doing certain stimulus policies. You've got to get them to mesh and then hope that the pandemic stays where it is. Well, the Reserve Bank of Australia, as you mentioned, held its last monthly meeting for 2021, widely tipped to keep interest rates at the current record low rate of 0.1%. That is exactly what happened. The RBA spoke afterwards and released some statements saying there's a concern about prices from a global supply chain problem at the moment, as well as very low wage growth, stagnant wage growth in this country. That's despite the fact that Australia's economy continues to surge ahead at a better than expected rate. One very big problem in this country continues to be one of the biggest economic drivers at the moment, and that is the nation's housing market. Prices are surging at a level not seen here for decades. Some analysts warn that the continued price rise in the entire market here is something that no one can afford. Selling a home in Sydney has rarely been more profitable.
In the last year, the price rises in the sort of wake of the worst of the pandemic have been at a level which has been quite extraordinary.
Sydney has experienced the biggest increase. The median house price jumped 30% in just 12 months. Many cities are seeing the steepest rises in more than 3 decades.
Have to be around 2.1 or better.
Record low interest rates are driving a rush to secure home loans and helping to create what appears to be a post-pandemic economic driver. University of New South Wales professor Hal Pawson sees it much differently.
Housing is really an unproductive asset, and we're sinking, really as a country, we're sinking far too much money, too much debt. We're committing too much of our income to paying for that debt on a product that doesn't really create a lot of employment and knock-on economic activity beyond itself.
The dream of home ownership is slipping away for an increasing number of people.
If we have a growing gap between people who have a lot of wealth and people who are doing ordinary jobs but who are unable to sort of, take advantage of the benefits of home ownership, then that grows all sorts of social divisions.
Housing advocates say higher income families are moving to regional areas in search of larger properties. That trend is preventing more people who live in those areas from accessing rental markets.
It's been really heartbreaking and stressful.
Naomi Thompson has spent the last 2 years trying to find a home to rent in the New South Wales city of Orange.
It's soul destroying and heart crushing that time and time and again I look and there's just nothing I can do, and I don't feel very good. It's very it demoralizes your self-worth.
There's been a long-held belief that Australia's housing market is fueled by a lack of adequate supply, meaning there simply aren't enough houses in many cities, including here in Sydney. But over the last couple of years, the country's international borders have remained closed, and the migration tap has essentially been turned off.
So in actual fact, it's government policy that's really behind some of the increases in house prices.
Housing advocates want the federal government to scrap outdated policies originally designed decades ago to encourage property investment through tax concessions. Pawson says Australia needs to adopt a national housing strategy.
The problems that are caused by the housing system are not only problems that affect a relatively small number of individuals who are directly affected.
Otherwise, he says, skyrocketing house prices will continue to come with the kind of costs that no one can really afford. And to give you an idea of what we're talking about, the suburb that I'm in is about a 15 minutes drive from Sydney's central business district. The median house price here is $3 million, and just over $3 million. The median house rent is approaching $1,000. That's per week, not per month. And those prices have shot up by an incredible percentage. Now, house prices are expected to slow as we head into the start of next year and potentially drop as we get nearer to the RBA announcing when it might raise interest rates, although that on its own, analysts say, won't do much to address issues of inequality and inaccessibility for a lot of people. That, they say, will still have to rely on government intervention. But as we approach an election, very little talk at this point here in Australia about rising house prices.
All right, many thanks for that report. Our Greg Namarro live for us there in Sydney. And for more on Australia's home prices, let's bring back Professor John Gong from UIBE. Professor Gong, are you concerned that home prices in Australia are becoming a bit too overpriced, a bit too stretched? Our Greg Navarro was just speaking to a potential buyer and renter, and she was characterizing this entire search for housing as soul-crushing.
Absolutely. I think the concern is not just for people out there who have a problem of finding affordable housing. I think there's also a general consensus that the real estate market in Australia is forming a large bubble, that it's difficult to have a soft landing here. I think the biggest problem is that is with respect to the land use policy here. Australia with about 25 million people, the size of Beijing and Shanghai with that kind of a population, and living in such a vast amount of land there. But the Australian government has a policy essentially of land use similar to Hong Kong. It has very restrictive land development policy. It encourages only urban renovation and what it describes as urban densification. It discourages more land development. So that's restricting the supply of land. I mean, housing is really driven by the supply is driven by the use of land. The developers are not allowed to do this. That's causing the biggest problem in my view.
Yeah, and Professor, our Greg Navarro was also talking about wages. I mean, wage growth in Australia right now is simply not keeping up with inflation. I mean, how big of an issue is that for home prices in Australia?
Yeah, usually, the affordability of housing is measured based on housing price and income ratio. Now, with a limited wage increase speed, the housing prices increasing at a much larger rate. So it's becoming more and more unaffordable for a lot of people, for the working class people, and ultimately that affects Australians' economic competitiveness. And it's also creating the story we are talking about, this kind of a humanitarian problem for a lot of people, especially I think for single moms, for young people, low-income people. And that's a very, very tragic thing to see.
Yeah, and it's expected that the Reserve Bank of Australia, Professor, will raise interest rates well before its previous target of 2024. Could this cause major disruptions, you think, to the Australian economy if we see the RBA take action faster and more than expected?
Well, I think the central bank is constrained by the need to battle inflation, and inflation is coming in every corner of the world. But at the same time, inevitably it's going to take a toll on the economy, and especially I think for people who are going to carry out a mortgage, they're going to be hit very hard on this. But in terms of addressing the housing market problem, it's not going to help. I don't think it's going to fundamentally change that. It's not going to cool down the market, and housing prices continue to rise. Ultimately, it's the supply that's driving everything. So with the limited supply, but with the increasing demand, I mean, Australia has a still very robust birth rate. It is probably the highest among the industrialized countries. And also on top of this, the strong immigration into the country, you see demand still rising up much faster than supply can catch up. And ultimately, I think, you're going to create this problem that you like to increase supply for the housing, but at the same time, you're worried about the hard landing for the bubble we're creating right now.
Yeah, a delicate balancing act indeed. Always a pleasure to speak with you, Professor. Professor John Gong there from UI.